Go ahead, Kai.
Oh, are we live?
Yeah, you're live. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Great. Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe and wearing masks and reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. It is her vision that has made this program possible. Please note that our next event is on January 5th with Peter Baker, the White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Susan Glasser, a staff writer for the New Yorker. They will be discussing with me their magisterial biography of James Baker, no relation. The book is appropriately entitled The Man Who Ran Washington. But tonight we are here to celebrate Evan Osnos and his new biography of President-elect Joe Biden. That phrase sounds very nice to say after all these months. President-elect Joe Biden, yes. The book is called Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. Evan will be in conversation with me, and we momentarily may have his father, Peter Osnos, as well with us, a well-known publisher and editor of many biographies. But Peter is having trouble logging on at the moment, and so we'll see. We're going to go ahead with or without him. Evan Osnos won the National Book Award for Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. That book was published in 2015. He is a staff writer at the New Yorker, where he served as the China correspondent from the year 2008 to 2013. His father began journalism career in 1965 as an editorial assistant to investigative journalist I.F. Stone. From 1966 to 1984, Peter Osnos worked for the Washington Post. He was a foreign correspondent, then he served as national editor. In 1984, he joined Random House, leaving journalism, and became a book publisher and editor. A decade later, he founded Public Affairs. He served as publisher and CEO until 2005 and is currently a consulting editor. Peter has a new book being published himself in May of 2021 entitled An Especially Good View. Please look for all of these new books online at bookshops.org, a site that leads you to your local independent bookstore. So we're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes and then take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and I will be sure to get to as many as I can. We'll try to end this program after about an hour, but we're a little flexible. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our events. Evan, congratulations on this formidable accomplishment. We all know how hard it is to finish a biography.
Thank you.
I want to begin by suggesting to everyone out there that Evan faced a peculiar dilemma with this book, in that many of his potential readers here in America probably think they know all about Joe Biden. After all, he's been a national politician for more than 40 years. But we biographers know that this is not the case. So Evan, tell us something startlingly new about Biden's life that you learned while writing this book.
Well, I have to say, I think, as you said, and Kai, by the way, it is a great pleasure to be here with you, talking about this subject and talking about, I feel like I am just tiptoeing into the world of real biographers, of which you are emphatically one. And I am interested in the art of it and the science of it. Thank you very much. I came into this, I have to say, with a bit of trepidation about the idea of writing about Biden, partly because of precisely what you described, which is that he's been a part of our public life for half a century. And people feel, particularly in the present moment, as if they may know all they need to know about him, either because they know he's not Donald Trump, or because they say, I kind of reached a view of Joe Biden in 1988 or 91 or '08 or any points along the way, and I know enough. And the challenge for me was to try to say, how do you take this person who has been kind of flattened, rendered two-dimensional by the business of my day job in journalism and political journalism, and how do you actually begin to sort of pull out the accordion a bit and make him into somebody who is a three-dimensional figure? And to give you an example of the kind of thing that I didn't know about him when I started, I suppose, something that kind of changed my perception of him. I'll give you one short story, which is that in the very first run he made for the Senate in 1972, the image that we have of Biden was this person who was, I would say, sort of 80% ambition and 20% policy at that point. And he finds himself on the debate stage against this giant of Delaware politics. His opponent was Caleb Boggs, and Caleb Boggs has held every major office in the state. Delaware has only 12 people in it, so Caleb Boggs loomed large. And Biden has this moment. He's running against him as the young guy on the scene, and Boggs bungled a question. It was a question about foreign affairs he didn't know the answer to. And the moderator turns to Biden and gives him a chance to sort of run his sword through his opponent. And I think the Biden we thought we knew at that period would have sort of gleefully done it. And instead, what he did, in fact, was he held his fire. And he held his fire because, as he said later, I recognize that nobody out there wanted to see Caleb Boggs humiliated on that debate stage. So it was a combination of prudent politics. He recognized the moment. He had actually more of a fingertip feel for the subtleties of what he was doing, which is to say he was a baby candidate running against somebody who had been a colossus in people's lives for a long time. And he realized he needed to beat this guy, but he didn't want to make this a dispiriting display. And that was a subtle read. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do in my writings about him is to acknowledge the fact that to get where he has got in this process requires a level of political skill that we sometimes forget. And we'd say he got here for circumstantial reasons or for some combination of skill and persistence. The truth was he got here partly because he has a very subtle understanding of the political temperature, and he can read. Yeah. He can read.
Well, that's interesting. That he had the emotional intelligence on the debate stage at that moment to know that he shouldn't go for the cutthroat response. That he needed to look like an adult and be a little patient, and
exactly.
That's very interesting. Now, one of the things that struck me about your book is that you got into a little more than I knew about his background and his family. Like, I was surprised to hear that, as recently as 10 years ago, he was still paying off Beau Biden's college loans.
Yeah.
Which says something about his personal wealth and finances. And yet, on the other hand, you clue us into the fact that in 2016, 2018, after he left the vice presidency, he earned $15 million in speeches and book advances and whatnot. And yet his father, Big Joe, he's, I'd really like to know more about Big Joe.
Yeah.
Because he apparently was wealthy, as a young man, and then lost it all.
Yeah.
And that must have been a real, family story that affected our Joe Biden.
Very much so.
And gave him a sense of vulnerability and a sense of being middle class and working class, and the fact that you can lose it all. That was just
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, there is this, you identified a really important kind of central nerve that runs through the family story and the family self-narrative, which is to say that they did have money. They started with money. Big Joe, Joe Biden's father, he was descended from a family of kind of up and down entrepreneurs. They had some successes, they had some failures. There is a lot of there is some mist that surrounds that period of the family history. And Joe Biden himself, I think, doesn't know all the details about why the businesses worked and why they didn't. And
Right.
by the time that President-elect Joe Biden was growing up, the money was gone. And there was this one artifact. It was literally a polo mallet that was in the closet that Big Joe kept. And it was this kind of holy relic of the old days when they had money and they had houses and the family, was sort of arrayed across the Eastern Seaboard. And then Big Joe, after all, he lost his job in Scranton. He ended up in coming to Delaware, fixed boilers for a living initially, eventually ended up as a car salesman. And there's this moment, I think, that in some ways crystallizes the family's insecurities to some degree about its financial position. The father was at a Christmas party when the boss of the auto dealership threw a bucket of silver dollars out on the floor. This was supposed to be fun. People were going to scramble around and pick it up. And Big Joe Biden was not going to scramble around and pick up the silver dollars. And he grabbed his wife, Jean's hand, and they marched out of there. And of course, he was fired in the process of that.
I love that anecdote. It really, gets at the insecurity and at this sense of pride, this prickly pride that Joe Biden has, that we saw, on the campaign trail every once in a while. He would get up and be, angry even if he was challenged on a sort of issue of pride and status. Yeah. That's.
I mean, that's actually a key feature of his persona. And I actually think in the end, that level of what I think of as productive insecurity turns out to be an essential active ingredient in his politics, because he was always aware when he came to Washington that he was the guy who went to the University of Delaware. He was not the Rhodes Scholar. He was not the Harvard law degree holder. And
he was a poor student in law school, right?
He
graduating 76 out of a class of 85.
As he himself put it, in his memoir, he wrote in the third person one sentence, which was, Joe Biden wasn't hitting the library much on Saturday nights. So there was a touch of the fact that he reveled in the idea that he had the gift of gab, and he was kind of physically adept. I mean, he'd been a football player and so on, and he could hold a stage, he could hold a room, but he was not the guy who was going to be poring over his books. And that little bit of insecurity has turned out, the reason why I think it's productive is that it becomes one of the reasons why he is the person who is in pursuit of information he doesn't have. He doesn't assume he knows everything. I mean, I had a bunch of interesting encounters with people over the years as I was gathering anecdotes about Joe Biden, in which they would describe a moment in which, I mean, there's a great letter, goes back to the 70s, that he wrote to Hannah Arendt seeking this obscure lecture that she delivered in Boston, because he was trying to, kind of study up. And that became a feature of his that continues really right up until today.
Yeah, you at one point in the book, you say, you flat out describe him as intellectually insecure. And for that reason, he knows it. He knows that he doesn't know. He bends over backwards to over prepare, and so that's kind of boy, that's a good thing in many ways.
I think so. Look, as you know, Kai, writing this, I'm in the context of where we are right now, which is we have been beset by 4 years of a president for whom knowledge is an offense. He just finds the idea of the acquisition of knowledge to be somehow diminishing. And I returned over and over again in my own research to those moments when I would see Joe Biden seeking to get the information he doesn't have and to use it. I mean, somebody said to me in the White House, who worked very closely with him and President Obama, told the story that Biden would sometimes call him up and say, can you come down and brief me on this subject? And this source of mine would go down the hall and they'd sit down. And in those moments, sometimes Biden would talk for 90% of the time. But in that other 10%, as this person said, he would pick things up. He would pick up things and he would build it into his models, his analytical models, his understandings of the world, really important facts. And then, of course, he would clap him on the back and say, great talk. And out they would go. But I think that has been an essential piece of his. We seem to have.
Are we being joined by Father Osnos?
I just want you to know that the whole reason we went through this exercise is so that I didn't get in the way of my son's. It's an old story with me is they keep saying all you want to do is get in Krauser's son.
I thought it would be fun to have the two of you together.
You know, it would be fun, except I'm aged 5 years on this wretched machine here. I think this is a question of technical capability. But anyway, you can see that he seems to be doing fine without me.
Well, Peter, welcome. This is Peter Osnos, who is a world-famous publisher and editor and former Washington Post foreign correspondent.
Exasperated.
And I assume you're the very proud father of Evan.
Yes. I've prepared extensively for days to be able to participate in this. So you may have to go to 7:30 or 8 in order to.
So Peter, are you surprised that your son followed in your footsteps, becoming a journalist, and is now become a biographer?
I am not surprised, in the sense that I've thought about when I knew he was going to be a journalist, and I think it came when he on the day after Dr. Seuss died. Evan was then a sophomore in high school at the Greenwich High School, and his first ever byline in the Greenwich Beak was an appreciation of Dr. Seuss. But that would have been easy enough, except that he had to call Dr. Seuss's publisher's son to get a comment. So he did some investigative reporting. And his
reporter even then.
Dr. Seuss with exclusive detail from the son of the publisher. So that's when I knew he was going to be fine. And then from there on, the rest is history.
Well, I was just about to ask Evan what he, as the biographer, was not able to see in terms of sources. Were there people who refused to talk to you? Were there, I assume, of course, there are archives that are closed. I mean, Biden's correspondence is, or maybe his Senate papers are open since he's been in the Senate for 40 years. I don't know. What sources were you not able to see?
Well, it is an unusual condition that he is an active office holder. And I think, for that reason, when I started on this process, I was more interested in saying, okay, what can I gather in the moment now, rather than the process of what will come later, which will be the full biography. And, there are already people at work on that process. And from my perspective, I said, this is a chance for me to try to, in effect, try to gather a long essay about a man and a moment and try to put those two things in conversation with one another. And, but Biden's papers are available in some measure, but that's not what was the basis for this book. And, but I have friends who are already at work on the next Biden biography.
Right. No, and when the papers are open, I presume they're going to be huge, just because he's had such a long career. There must be a very long paper trail. But to your knowledge, he didn't keep a diary at any point in his life, or?
No, he's not really been a writer. He did keep a diary. That's not true, actually. He did keep a diary, particularly around the illness of his son, Bo. And I make just a few references to it. He included a couple of references to his diary in a book that he wrote about his relationship with his son, called Promise Me, Dad. And that is an indicator, for me at least, it was a sign that there is more to be found in that.
Right.
I think that'll be a useful resource because, interestingly, he is somebody who is, he has a side of his mind that runs towards self-reflection, and we don't always associate that with him because he sort of lives a lot of his interior life out loud. But going through these moments of extraordinary trial, like the death of Beau Biden, he put pad to paper, and the bits of it that I've seen are quite moving.
Oh, that's interesting. That's promising. So let me ask you one more question before I turn it over to your father to let him do his critique of the book.
He knows a few things about books about presidents and by presidents, and I think it's worth.
I think he does.
He knows
but
a lot.
I was interested, Evan. I was interested in the way that you started the book. Biographers always struggle to figure out how to create a scene that draws the reader in and sets, gives an occasion to sort of describe your character. And sometimes it's a funeral. You take the end of the life and then you go back. And in your instance, you chose to this incident where he almost dies in 1988, a near-death experience with a brain aneurysm. And it was a very serious event, and you described this at some length. And I guess that was that a turning point in his own personal odyssey?
Yeah, it was, partly because it was the first moment of genuine physical frailty that he had in his life. And, he is somebody, as I think, anybody who has success of the kind he had when he was young, that in some ways made a big imprint on him, that he was kind of for a long time trapped in amber at the age of 29, because he was the guy who got to the Senate, by he was at that point too young to even take his seat. And then he gets to 1988 and he has just fallen out of the presidential race, by his own description, with some embarrassment, because of course it was the case that there were pieces of his speeches that he had taken from others. And so it ended in a way that was bewildering for him, because he had only had up until that point a series of uninterrupted achievements. And he then finds himself literally flat on his back, unable to move his legs. And it was such a grave illness that the surgeons called in a priest to deliver last rites. And Biden was out of the Senate for 7 months. And when he came back, he said, "I feel like I've been given a second chance on life." And I kept returning during the writing. I kept returning to this line that one of his friends, Ted Kaufman, his former chief of staff, had said to me at one point, the first time I was writing about Biden in the New Yorker now 6 years ago, when Ted Kaufman said, "If you ask me who the luckiest person I know is, I would tell you it's Joe Biden. And if you ask me who the unluckiest person I know is, it's Joe Biden." And that became this kind of underlying structure of his life. And that combination of both incredible good fortune and terrible trial and misfortune and mistakes in some cases of his own making, putting those two things together, that turned out, that's what cracked this open and made me understand what has shaped his mind, and ultimately why he's kind of suited for this moment. I mean, in a moment when we are as a country lying flat on our back, we have been undone by the events that we're contending with, the combination of Trump, the virus, the economy, and so on. And here is a person who has been through that. And for that reason, it struck me as a kind of natural way to tell this story that, began on the molecular level rather than on the political level. Because I toyed with various openings that were political, and it felt like this needed to be something more organic in the fullest sense of the word.
More personal.
Yeah, exactly.
So Peter, what is your take on the book as an editor, not as a father?
Well, let me. As a father, we could do it some other time, and that time I will show up when I'm supposed to. The issue here is, I want to talk just a bit about the phenomenon of the book as a book, the publishing saga of the book, which is interesting as a reflection of where we are in the American political and culture at the moment. So Evan put this together, basically. I don't know if you talked about this before I got on, but he did it in a week. He had done an enormous amount of work before, and literally from a Thursday to a Thursday, he had the wit and the skill to take, and the publisher had the energy and commitment to take what was material and turn it into this narrative, and to get it out in digital and audio in 6 weeks. And then there's a printed book on the 3rd or 4th week of October. In other words, it was done extremely quickly. Another element of the book was that all over the world, people want to read it. I mean, I was so pleased to hear that Evan had sold Albanian rights, Lithuanian rights, in Germany and the UK. And here, interestingly, the reaction to the book is favorable, positive, but there is the element which you and I can talk about that disturbs me, which is the sense that, oh God, yeah, Biden. You know, we know about Biden. Do I really need to spend, 3 or 4 days or whatever time it takes to, because I'm a busy guy, to read a book about Biden? I'm getting the feeling that as we go into the Biden presidency, one of the things that the country, which, as Evan said, has PTSD now, is they don't appreciate just the extraordinary story of Joe Biden. And that's what came through to me as I read the book. I too have watched Biden, we're exactly the same generation and age. And I watched Biden over the years without a great deal of what I would say passion. But reading the book, I came away with a sense, this is a remarkable man. What he's endured personally and politically, and what he overcame in his campaign this year, when people already thought that he was, on March the 2nd, he was dead in the water. It was going to be Bloomberg. And then the following Tuesday, he wins in South Carolina, and he's the candidate. And what's interesting to me is the way the American public has reacted to the book. Positively, it's been a great success on every level, except the sense I get is, well, we don't really need to know about Joe Biden. What do you think about that? Do you have that feeling that the country is really, it's so numb from all of what we've been through that it is really not able to accept the nature of the Biden presidency and even the Kamala vice presidency? Is a hell of an, extraordinary historic event. And I have the feeling that he's coming into it without the kind of momentum and brio. When Barack was elected, he was thrilling to those people who were thrilled and appalling to the people who were appalled. When Trump was elected, it was appalling to those of us who were appalled and clearly thrilling to some. With Biden, you have this feeling that people aren't really, I keep saying, is he the Harry Truman of the 21st century? That he comes in without a lot of feeling that this is a success, going to be a successful presidency. But he's really ready. Anyway,
See, I think it's a really astute point, and I think it actually, the degree to which Biden is kind of generally underestimated is a recurring theme that we see over the course of the last year. Now, I think you could argue that coming into the presidency with a sense of diminished expectations around him is a tremendous blessing. I mean, one of the things that Barack Obama says in his memoir is when they came to him and said, "You've won the Nobel Peace Prize," what his reaction was "For what?" And it was a terrible yoke across the shoulders. I mean, to go into the presidency with these outrageous expectations of what would be possible. Biden comes in a very different mode. I mean, he's coming in He's muted personally. He is making a point to not try to say, I am the transcendent solution to all your problems. What he says is, and Barack Obama didn't say that either. People heard that, even if he didn't say it, and he certainly didn't. Biden says, to use his term, I'm a transition president. I mean, that is the kind of thing you don't hear very often from presidents. And I think it's actually a degree of self-awareness that he recognizes that there were not only 70 million Americans who voted for the other guy, but a lot of Democrats who said, this isn't the moment for Joe Biden's to be my nominee. And for that reason, this goes back to something that Kai, you and I were talking about dead before you got on, was this idea that Biden has sort of these pretty good nerve endings for politics that we sometimes underappreciate. And I think he recognized that if he came into this and said, congratulations, I'm your president, that's not where the people were. And in a way, this gets to the writing of the book, that part of the reason why I gravitated to Joe Biden for the first time I wrote about him, it was in 2014, was precisely because he wasn't the main event in Washington. I mean, I came to it as a foreign correspondent. I'd been abroad for a decade. I moved back to Washington, and the number of people who were lining up to get to hear the dulcet tones of Joe Biden was precisely zero. I mean, it was not the most coveted ticket in town, but he was doing a lot of foreign affairs. I was interested in foreign affairs. And then something interesting happened, something kind of surprising. I started interviewing him at the White House, and to make a bold admission, I liked him, which is something that does not always happen. I mean, a New Yorker profile subject who I wrote about once said to me, if you're going to agree to be profiled by the New Yorker, you better like yourself, because at the end of it, they're going to find out everything there is to know about you. And it felt that as I was moving through this process, what I liked about Biden, this was not just sort of a sentimental, he's a nice enough guy. What I really meant was, he was not seeking to fundamentally deceive me. And I found that to be quite startling in the moment in which I was landing in Washington, 2014, in which there were, I would say the full apparatus of deception was coming from every angle, particularly on Capitol Hill. And that was what kept me going back and back to this guy. And so I didn't think he'd be president.
That's very interesting. What we're learning is, or what you guys are saying is that A, he has the advantage of low expectations, and B, he has the advantage of sort of a knowing his intellectual insecurities, and he has the advantage of a long, 4.5 decades of making mistakes and learning from them. So you go in the book, for instance, to, he has a tendency, like all politicians, to exaggerate. So he exaggerated his role in the civil rights movement. But you do point out, Evan, that he actually did, if he didn't march, he actually did walk out of a Wilmington diner that refused to serve a black classmate in 1961. Mm-hmm. And he picketed a segregated movie theater in the following year, in 1962. And you humanize him. After the terrible car crash that killed his first wife, he was, you say, suicidal.
Yeah.
So this gives us, I think, a different image of him. Now, here's a story I want to get in from my Carter biography and process that's coming out next May. I have one story about Joe Biden and Carter that is sort of a window on, I think, how Biden has evolved. He's made a lot of mistakes. He has a tendency to have misjudgments. So this is the anecdote I wanted to tell. In January of '77, Carter is about to be inaugurated, and he nominates one Ted Sorensen for CIA directorship. And, some people thought that was a brilliant selection, and many thought it was a minefield. But it immediately became controversial. partly because Ted Sorensen had been a CO during World War II. And however, that wasn't what killed the nomination. What killed it was Joe Biden holding a press conference and coming out with a copy of a sworn affidavit that Sorensen had signed on behalf of Dan Ellsberg, who in 1971 was put on trial for stealing the Pentagon Papers. And Sorensen had signed a note saying, well, you know, in those days, high administration officials routinely took home classified papers. It was no big deal. I took home 8 boxes.
That was the
He
end of
says
that.
this in the letter. And so Biden gets a hold of this letter and releases it at a press conference. And he goes on the record saying, now this makes me wonder whether Ted Sorensen himself should be charged with treason or should go to prison for, and you know, when I saw this story, I just, what a sort of, I think it was an example of having a tin ear on the politics of the situation. And you know, it put Carter in a terrible position. He had to essentially go to Ted Sorensen and ask him to withdraw. But Biden does this again and again in his career, you know, with the Clarence Thomas hearings and not understanding that he should have had more women testify. You know, he has an emotional intelligence, as we were talking about earlier, but he also has had a long record of sort of making misjudgments. But I think he's learned from them, no? And so he seems to be at this stage of his life ready to listen to all sources and learn more and try to create a coalition. So who knows?
Yeah.
Before Evan answers, let me just say that I just finished reading Obama's memoir, all 700 pages, which I gather is even shorter than your Carter biography.
Yes.
But and you know, you mentioned Sorensen, and as you know, Evan certainly knows, it's been my experience, having worked with at various times with Carter on his books, Bill Clinton on his 2 of his books, Donald Trump, God help us, on 2 of his books, and Barack on the original book. And I knew Ted Sorensen. What I find, and I don't know Biden, what I find with all of them is something comparable. That you have to have a certain urge to succeed in order to put yourself through what American politics now requires. You also have to be a little bonkers because the pressure and the abuse is relentless. And, you know, Ted Sorensen, to his last breath, would not admit that he wrote Profiles in Courage.
Uh-oh.
There was a degree of loyalty to Kennedy, who was a vexed figure despite his charisma. Bill Clinton, God knows, was vexed. Barack, if you read his book, is extraordinary for his ability to look at himself in a genuine way. And as we all know, Trump is a you know, the narcissism and everything that everybody's ever said about him is true. The thing that's interesting to me about Biden is that he's a 360 person.
Mm-hmm.
He's all the things that a person can be. He's a good father. He's a good husband. He's a good citizen. When I listen to the interview that Ev did, which is on the audio with Biden, and what I hear him saying is something which I so wanted to hear. Somebody who I thought was actually saying what he meant and believed. And we have become so inured to hearing people actually speak with sincerity and believe them that maybe we don't appreciate just what we've got here. We have a 360 human, which is to say, Kai, He's done stupid things. He's made mistakes. He is a klutz sometimes.
But he knows it.
Yeah.
But you know, somebody who overcame the stutter, overcame the death of his beloved wife and child. I mean, that's human. And what I think we need in a president is somebody who is human, because we've had one, frankly, who's not. And therefore, the country is in this very state of sort of agitated PTSD is what I call it. Anyway, sorry to intervene, because I've never intervened.
No, it makes total sense.
Never before. Every one of our dinner conversations, I just sit quietly. So
if we proceed with Robert's Rules of Orders at home, I think I totally agree. I mean, look, as you know, the thing that drew me back to this guy was that it was a life in full. I mean, it was this, you know, honestly, Kai, the first time I wrote about Biden, I didn't have kids yet. And I could sort of intellectually describe the experience of having lost his daughter and having his sons in the hospital and losing his wife. And then later, you know, I come back to the subject after a few years, and I have 2 kids now. And it's a different way of understanding the nature of suffering. And I think, you know, that became for me, I think, you know, one of the things that I find challenging about the way that we do so much political journalism is that we're constantly on the lookout for that, for the cynical motive. We're constantly looking out for that, you know, okay, you're being played here, or, oh, they gave you that line, or he's used that story before. And what I found in the end incredibly almost addictive about interviewing Joe Biden, about understanding his life, was that he spins, everybody spins, but that wasn't the primary motive. He really was not going out there to feed me a line. I mean, I will spare there's a certain US senator who I've written about who was so determined to give me just an absolutely splendid landscape of nonsense that the whole experience just drove me away from writing about members of the Senate for years. I couldn't do it anymore because the ascending to the mountaintop of nonsense. I'm using a polite word, but anyway, Biden just didn't do that, and I found that quite encouraging, actually. You know.
So I just want to tell everyone we're going to go over a little longer than 7 o'clock, and we will take some time for Q&As, but we got a late start, so we'll go a little later too.
Can I have another question?
Sure.
One of the things that's been very striking as we've been following the transition, so, you know, this whole tumult of the transition, is media coverage, which almost immediately defaults to, you know, risk and conflict. That pressure on Biden. Did he choose the right person? The left, the right, the top, the bottom, who's he got? It's as though he can't possibly be given a break. Now, that's partly because we're so conditioned to that now. We've been living through it. Do you think that Biden feels the pressure when he hears that AOC or Bernie or any of this other business, or that maybe what's her name, Tandanita, the new OMB person, or that the fact that the Black Pentagon guy is a general and so forth? Do you think that, given that he's been around for so long and he's finally at the mountaintop, how much pressure do you think he feels to adhere to the requirements of today's sort of media and political universe?
Well, I think he takes pretty seriously this idea that his cabinet needs to be very diverse and kind of representative of the country generationally, and that's, you know, it's a cliche, but that's kind of 5-dimensional chess, to try to make sure that you're representing the full spectrum of the American experience, and also the generational element, and also people who can get into the job and navigate this incredibly complicated moment. So that is for real. It's not a kind of put on. And yet at the same time, I think he's quite insulated in a way from the fine grain, hour by hour social media phenomenon, because he doesn't participate in the social media. I mean, I've asked him about what's your relationship like to Twitter, because after all, according to Twitter, He was dead in the water several times, during this campaign. He was dead on arrival. I mean, from the very beginning. And he gets tweets that are given to him in the morning as part of his daily briefing, but he doesn't get on there. God knows he's not doing what Donald Trump is doing. But there's a strength there that allows him to somewhat screen out what is in the end not the main event and is a certain amount of just atmospheric pressure. But that can be a risk because his world now moves extremely fast. It moves a lot faster, the political tempo does, than when he sat down and typed out a letter to Hannah Arendt in the mid-1970s asking her to send him, a lecture of some interest. And so he needs to figure out a way, and I think he's doing this, he did it during the campaign, of surrounding himself with people who have the metabolism and are able to kind of digest some of what's coming in and decide what really matters. But I will tell you the bottom line on this is, and this I think is an idea that we will probably hear again over the course of the next few years, is that when Joe Biden confronts things like pressure and loss, his answer is often very consistent, which is, I know what real loss is. I've been through real loss. And in fact, there was a moment during the campaign, and I didn't include it in the book, but it's kind of a telling little detail that Anita Dunn, who was, of course, one of the people who was really running the show, she called him before South Carolina and said, look, we're really so low on money here that this campaign may not survive much longer. And you may need to hold just enough money in the bank to be able to pay people severance. But that's really close to the end. And, this is not a conversation you ever want to have with a candidate. And I asked her, I said, how did he respond to that? I mean, was he, he happened to be on Amtrak at that particular moment, as he often is. And was he thundering against the heavens? What was he doing? And she said, no, he just kind of said, I have lost bigger things than this. If it doesn't carry on, that's what we'll get through this. But I mean, that's a way to navigate this moment.
That's very interesting. Shows a sort of solidness, a character that's been through a lot. There, at one point in your book, you tell this surprising anecdote to me. I just find it almost shocking. He is introduced to Putin, and he comes up to him, and on a play off of what George W. Bush did when he said he had met Putin and he looked into his eyes and saw his soul, Biden apparently came right up to Putin and said, I don't think you have a soul, looking into his eyes. It's a great anecdote, but it leads me to ask you, how do you think President Biden is going to deal with the thuggish leaders of the Middle East? And here I'm thinking not only of General Sisi in Egypt, but also Crown Prince MBS in Saudi Arabia, but also, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. Yeah.
I'll tell you one addendum to that story, which I think is also kind of revealing, is Putin's reply. When he said that to him, the two of them were in an office, and Putin listened to him say, I don't think you have a soul. And Putin said, I'm glad we understand one another. Of course, this was, and now, I actually, when Biden told me that story, I sort of pushed him on it. And I said, that sounds to me like a movie line. I mean, the whole business just sounds like. And he said, absolutely, positively, it happened. And I then reported it out a bit with somebody else who was on the trip. And that person says that when he came out of the office, the two of them had been in there with just an interpreter, Biden and Putin and the interpreters. And Biden came out of the office and told that story to somebody who was in the entourage right at that moment, privately.
Okay, there we go.
So we'll see. I think it's one of the more, it is a window into how he feels about Putin. That has been a very consistent line of his. I mean, the first time I talked to him about Putin, this was 2014. And he said, I think we as a country are underestimating this person and the menace that emanates from him. And I remember thinking, and I'm telling a story on myself, I remember thinking he's paying too much attention to this regional power. Russia's not the ball game anymore. We should be talking about China. And he was onto something. I think there's a piece of this that is forged in his foreign policy experience during the Cold War that served him well in sort of analyzing what Putin was becoming. When it comes to the Middle East, he has a long-term relationship with Bibi Netanyahu, and it's not altogether friendly. I mean, they have done things to one another that have sort of they've kicked each other here and there over the years. There was one time when Biden was making a trip to Israel, and Bibi chose that moment to announce settlement construction. It was a way of a kind of kicking sand on the Obama administration. At the same time, they have an understanding of what each one's chemistry is like and what their political reality is like. Biden comes into this with a much more sophisticated understanding of Israeli politics than obviously Trump ever could. And he comes to it with an unburdened position in a way that is different than how others have gone about it. I think Biden, one of the things I've learned from talking to people who have been with him in rooms when he talks to foreign leaders, the thing that comes through for me is he has a tendency to be unusually blunt. And I spoke to former Senator Bill Bradley at one point when I was working on this about Biden, and the two of them had gone over to Moscow together, and Biden listened to a disquisition from a Russian propagandist, and at the end, Biden said, we have an old saying, which is that you can't shit a shitter. And the Russian interlocutor took this on board. And Bradley walked out and said to the interpreter, the American interpreter, how did you translate that exchange? And the interpreter said, not literally. Look, I think when he's going to get to the Middle East, he's not a particular fan of MBS. We know that. He has said pretty clearly that he believes that the Trump administration mishandled the Saudi relationship. He's concerned about the destruction to democracy that this has kind of abetted. But he's not going to evacuate the Middle East any faster than I think other presidents who have gone in thinking they could will be able to do. It's complex. He's going to be there a while. But
Evan, do you think he's a one-term president in his head?
No, I don't, actually. I think he is genuinely unresolved on that matter. And, I went into this process earlier this year, pushing his people to say, look, if he's only going to do one term, I want him to tell me that. I need to know that. That's material information. And it's the kind of thing that, I don't want to find out later that this is actually something that you really believe. And they said, you are going to hit a stone wall when you try that with him. And I tried it from every angle. And the truth is, he knows politically that if he said it today, he'd be a lame duck. And all we'd ever talk about is, is it going to be Kamala or somebody else and so on. So there's the political side of him that prevents him from reaching that judgment. But then there's a personal side of it, which is that, he really does genuinely believe that he can do this job as long as he can do this job. And at the moment when it's not going to be, when he's not doing it well, he knows there are people around him who will tell him. Principally, it'll be Jill Biden and Val Owens, his sister, will be the first people who say it's time. But this is not, from his perspective, he doesn't need to say right away. He can decide more or less in the second half of his second year what his plan is going to be, and I think that's genuine.
The question.
Okay, so I think we should go to some questions from the audience. But Peter, we can have you jump in as well.
There is one
during this Q&A. But the first question was actually very close to what you were talking about. Someone wants to know who will be able to tell President Biden that he should rethink an issue or policy.
Well, interestingly, if we step outside the family, I've been reporting around on the subject of Ron Klain's relationship with Biden because it's interesting. And Klain is one of the only people in Biden's immediate orbit who can challenge him wholeheartedly, full-throated objection, and then get up again and live to fight another day. They have this long-running, very candid way of talking to one another. And I was
Okay.
sort of trying to understand how similar or different it was to Rahm Emanuel and they have obviously completely different temperaments. Ron Klain is kind of cool to the touch. He's not quite the way that Rahm was, but he does have the ability to sit at a table in which everybody is participating in a kind of congenial groupthink and say, no, I think that's wrong. And I think Klain may turn out to be somebody who is an important voice in the room beyond just the status of being the chief.
Right. Another question: how did Biden avoid Army service during Vietnam?
That's a good question. I think he was enrolled at that point he was in college and he was in law school, so he had an academic.
So he had a student deferment.
Yeah.
No.
Did he have bone spurs?
No bone spurs that I know of. He's bone spur free.
So, Evan, here's a question that could draw on your knowledge of China. Will Biden be able to end the trade war with China and foster a positive working relationship?
I think Biden believes, I know, we've talked about China, that he believes the Trump administration has mishandled it in a fundamental way. It's been a kind of an improvisation, and it has come, at the obvious expense of American consumers who are paying the price of these tariffs. So there are a whole range of ways in which Trump has done things that Biden would not do. However, Biden also believes that the China relationship is necessarily more competitive now, and should be more competitive now than it was when he left office in 2017. And that's been the biggest change in the world in the years since he was gone, is how he would describe it. And I also, importantly, how Jake Sullivan would describe it. And I think Jake is the incoming national security advisor is a key voice when it comes to the overall vision of how to deal with China. To be more specific, I don't think that the Biden administration is going to walk in and say, all right, we think the trade war was a mistake and therefore we're removing the tariffs. Frankly, that would be diplomacy malpractice. What they're going to do is come in and say, if you want these tariffs to go away, here are the things we want to have happen. And in order for them, in order to see progress on this, we need to see real progress. And we know what real progress looks like. We're not going to be satisfied with a few bushels of soybeans, which is essentially what Trump was looking for out of this. They'd say we want substantive movement on things like intellectual property rights, market access. And so it did not escape my attention that China waited a very long time to acknowledge Joe Biden's victory in this race. And I think that's because they are very sorry to see Donald Trump go.
Right. Here's another question. How will Biden insulate himself from attacks or investigation of his son? I guess Hunter.
Yeah, it is, insulating himself. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that. I think in a way, what we know at this point is that we've had at least 2 Republican-led committees that have gone looking for evidence that Joe Biden used the office of the vice president to help his son's business or to benefit from his son's business, and they found none of it. It's the reason Donald Trump was impeached, was that he was looking for that information from Ukraine, and ultimately Ukraine, of course, didn't provide it either. But he is facing now an unpleasant state of affairs, which is that his son evidently has been under investigation and will presumably continue to be under investigation. My guess is, I haven't talked to him about this, is that he will, and I know this for a fact, one of his beliefs is that part of Donald Trump's damage to the credibility of the United States was his personal involvement in the prosecution authority, and that he should never have gotten involved in what the Department of Justice is or is not pursuing, and that is in a way a kind of deep violation of American norms. Biden is going to keep, I think, as far away from this as he can. But let's be blunt. It is pretty painful to imagine your child being investigated by a Justice Department an investigation initiated under a president who was making flamboyant use of the power of prosecution as a way of attacking his political enemies. And for that to continue on into the Biden administration, I think we'll have to see where it leads. But I I don't expect that Biden himself is going to be involved in it in any way.
I should think he'd probably agree to appoint a special prosecutor, and Jimmy Carter had to put up with an investigation of Billy Carter's antics in Libya, and that would be the way to insulate him. From
in the Washington of the Carter era and before, Edward Bennett Williams, the great Washington lawyer, used to say, in Washington, they want to burn a witch every 3 months. They have to burn a witch every 3 months. And what happened really since Watergate, increasingly, is the need to burn a witch almost every other day. And so almost you can guarantee in any administration that there's going to be one thing or another. One of the remarkable things about the Obama administration is it never happened. But we now have a culture which is dependent on the kind of thing that the Hunter Biden business represents. And I think, as Evan said, that the fact that he's his son is different from Billy Carter. It's different from Nixon's brother, or the various sibling issues in the past. I think it's about as tough a call as he has to make. The idea that he would appoint a special prosecutor who could basically do what special prosecutors have done in the past, which is run amok. It's hard for me to picture. And
I actually wonder about whether he would do it, because for exactly that reason, which is, what the history of the last, essentially beginning with Ken Starr tells us, is that it moves in this, particularly in this polarized environment. It would just move in all kinds of directions and would become, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not yet convinced he'll do it, but you may be right, Kai. Kai, I think we may have lost your audio. It's showing a microphone symbol that is off. Do you want to see if you can unmute your microphone?
Well, that would just leave you and me talking. Now it's at long last.
Let's see, Kai, are you back?
Bluetooth is off, Kai. Yeah.
This may be a star-crossed affair technologically. So, Dad, is there anything you've been meaning to say? This is our moment.
Listen, when you were a child.
Yeah. Wait, Kai, we've lost you. He's the host. He's the host of the party.
I just want to say that the one time I did meet Joe Biden, I went up to him and I said, Mr. Vice President, you and I have one thing in common. And then he said, what's that? I said, Evan Osnos. He said, Evan. I said, that's my son. And he said, you did a hell of a good job.
I like it. I'll take that.
So I said, Biden, I'm immediately a big fan.
He's got your vote, huh? Well, we're now in a situation where the host of this affair has been rendered mute and deaf, and so we won't know when to bring this grand occasion to a close.
Kai, why are you muted? He doesn't. I don't think he knows.
I think that may be the end of it.
How are your children, Ev?
You mean your grandchildren? They're doing great.
They are my grandchildren. There's no question about it. Well, I think the mic is back on. Kai?
Kai? No.
Let's end it there, guys. We'll say goodnight, and that was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Well, that was great fun. Thank you, and I'm sorry about
that. Was terrific fun. I loved it. Thank you for the idea, and we'll do it again on another occasion. Thanks for having us.
Have a great night. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.